Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating tension that honestly defines so much of the modern human experience. We're talking about that stark contrast between our incredibly busy, hyper-distracted lives and the deep, persistent spiritual emptiness that so many people feel. So, to explore this, we're going to walk through the theological framework laid out by A.W. Tozer in his classic 1948 text, The Pursuit of God. We'll be taking an objective look at exactly how Tozer diagnosed this spiritual crisis, and we'll dig into the very specific internal solutions he proposed for achieving what he called true spiritual intimacy. To really anchor this explainer, we actually have to start right where Tozer does, with this incredibly famous thought from St. Augustine. Thou hast formed us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they find rest in thee. It just perfectly captures that internal hunger, that profound restlessness that drives the human spiritual quest. Tozer basically argues that this restlessness is baked right into our DNA. We are literally designed to find our ultimate rest in the divine, and until we do, we're just going to keep searching. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the problem-solution journey we'll take through Tozer's framework today. We'll start with the hunger for God, move to the tyranny of things, discuss removing the inner veil, explore the universal speaking voice, and finally end with the gaze of faith. Part 1. The Hunger for God, the Crisis of Modern Mechanical Religion. Tozer introduces a pretty heavy critique right out of the gate. He points out a massive, stark contrast between two very different approaches to faith. On one side, you have mechanical or sterile religion. This relies heavily on having the right opinions, external programs, and a lot of nervous activity. Millions of people have all the orthodox facts down perfectly. But on the other side, there's experiential religion. This actually requires a real spiritual thirst and a direct encounter with the manifest presence of God. Basically, Tozer is warning us that merely holding the correct theological data in your head is absolutely not the same thing as actually experiencing the divine presence. To really drive this point home, he cites this powerful line from John Milton. The hungry sheep look up and are not fed. Tozer makes the bold argument that believers are literally starving while seated right at the Father's table. And why is that? Well, because they're being fed theological fundamentals and correct interpretations rather than the spiritual nourishment of God himself. They have all the right words, sure, but they're completely lacking the reality. Section 2. The Tyranny of Things. The Necessity of Inner Renunciation. So if we're starving at the table, we've got to ask why. Tozer points the finger straight at our fiercely possessive human nature. He writes that the roots of our hearts have grown down into things. Now, when you relate this 1948 critique to our modern hyper-distracted digital lives, it honestly hits incredibly hard. Things, whether we're talking about physical possessions, relationships, status, or, our smartphones, have essentially usurped the inner shrine of the human heart that was originally meant only for God. We cling to these things so tightly that pulling them out feels like a literal kind of death. And this brilliantly illustrates Tozer's whole concept of renunciation. Using the Old Testament story of Abraham and Isaac, Abraham loved his son so fiercely that the relationship was bordering on perilous. Isaac was basically taking God's place in Abraham's heart. So God's commands the ultimate sacrifice. Not to actually take the boy's life, mind you, but to remove Isaac from the temple of Abraham's heart. Once Abraham makes the painful choice to trust and pull out that miserly root of possessiveness, he's given his son back. Now he possesses nothing in his heart, and yet he has everything. He's finally learned to hold the things of this world loosely. Moving to Section 3, Removing the Inner Veil, the Obstacle Blocking Human Awareness of God. We're shifting gears here from our outward attachment to physical things to deeply ingrained internal barriers. Let's see how this builds using a really vivid spatial metaphor. Tozer uses the Old Testament tabernacle to represent the soul's inward journey. You start out in the outer court for sacrifice and washing. Then you move into the holy place with the candlelight and the bread. But the ultimate goal, the whole point, is the Holy of Holies, the manifest presence of God. The catch? There is a thick, heavy veil completely separating the holy place from that Holy of Holies. In our own hearts, Tozer argues that veil is woven entirely out of our self-sins. It's things like self-righteousness, self-pity, self-confidence, self-sufficiency, self-admiration, and self-love. And the kicker is, these aren't just things we do. They are fundamentally what we are. These threads weave together to form a completely opaque veil inside of us, effectively blocking us from ever entering the Holy of Holies and experiencing God's presence. Now, Tozer definitely does not sugarcoat this process. Removing this inner veil of the self-life, it is not some lazy theoretical exercise. He says it must be torn out in agony. It's a painful, almost violent expulsion of our own ego and pride, where we have to bring our very nature to the cross for judgment. Because only when that veil is finally torn can we actually enter the presence. Part 4. The Universal Speaking Voice. The objective reality of God's presence. Okay, so once that veil is gone, what actually awaits us? To fully grasp this, we have to ground Tozer's theology in his specific definition of reality. He defines it as that which has existence totally apart from any idea any mind might have of it. It doesn't depend on the observer at all. The spiritual world and God are objectively real. They are entirely independent of our human imagination. Simply put, they are there whether we acknowledge them or not. So the crucial point here hinges on this definition of the word reckon. Because God is an absolute, objective reality, we don't have to visualize or invent him with our minds. Faith literally creates nothing. To reckon is to simply count upon that which is already there. We just have to accept and tune in to the absolute, already existing reality of the divine presence. And in that reality, Tozer asserts that God is continuously speaking. The universe is quite literally alive with God's voice. The problem, of course, is that our modern world is incredibly, overwhelmingly noisy. Tozer suggests that our safety in this loud, chaotic world actually lies in silence and listening, not in bluster and endless activity. If we just quiet down, we can hear the voice that fills the entire world with living potentiality. Section 5. The Gaze of Faith. Faith as a continuous gaze of the soul. We've talked a lot about the barriers, but what is the practical, day-to-day solution? You know, modern theologians tend to complicate faith tremendously, turning it into this massive, unsolvable philosophical puzzle. So I want to pose this directly to you as we wrap up Tozer's framework. How does he actually define faith? Well, he answers it with this beautifully functional and refreshingly simple definition. Faith is simply the gaze of a soul upon a saving God. It is not a rigid mental checklist of complex philosophical beliefs. It's simply the redirecting of our sight. It's intentionally getting out of the focus of our own vision and getting God into focus. Tozer uses a fascinating Old Testament story to explain the actual mechanics of this. When the Israelites were bitten by serpents in the wilderness, Moses held up a brass serpent on a pole. Anyone who simply looked at it lived. In this specific context, looking was identical to believing. Looking is believing. By looking outward at the object of faith, we are saved from the self-sins of constantly looking inward at ourselves. And honestly, the best part about this gaze of faith is its ultimate accessibility. Just think about the practical applications here. It requires absolutely no special equipment, no fancy religious paraphernalia. You can do it at any time, on any day of the week. You can do it anywhere, whether you're standing in your kitchen making coffee, riding on a train, or working a shift in a factory. This intimate, silent communion is available to anyone, anywhere, completely regardless of their circumstances. The ultimate goal of Tozer's whole journey is perfectly summarized right here. By practicing this inward gaze over and over, a new set of eyes develops within us. It eventually becomes an automatic spiritual reflex. We become able to continuously look at God on the inside, even while our outward physical eyes are busy navigating the tasks and the chaotic scenes of this passing world. This constant inward gaze is what completely resolves that restless spiritual emptiness we discussed at the very beginning. So, I want to leave you with this provocative question to chew on as you go about the rest of your day. Is your inner gaze currently focused on the tyranny of passing things, your phone, your status, your everyday worries, or is it resting quietly on the eternal presence of God? I really hoped this explainer has helped clarify Tozer's profound framework for finding true peace in a distracted world. Thanks so much for learning with me today, and I'll see you in the next one.